Ladies and gentlemen, we will now continue with the final session, Southeast Asia Political and Economic Landscape, chaired by Dr. Francis Hutchinson, Fellow and Coordinator of the Institute's Regional Economic Studies Program. Mr. Michael Montesano and Mr. Jahabar Sadiq will join Mr. Hutchinson at the table. So, over to Mr. Hutchinson.
Thank you very much. We have a little bit of bad news, and that is that our speaker for Myanmar, Professor Aung Tun Tet, is unable to join us for health reasons. For those of you interested in Myanmar particularly, his handout is included in your conference pack. In addition, at ICES, we do have a very vibrant Myanmar studies group, and through our research outputs such as Perspectives and ICES Monitor, we have a running commentary on the salient events in Myanmar. Our first speaker is Dr. Michael Montesano, who is a visiting fellow with us at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Francis. And at the chair's urging, I am going to use the rostrum. I want to thank ICES for the chance to speak to you this afternoon, and I want to thank everybody at ICES, especially Ms. Mei Wong and Dr. Li Po An, for their very hard work in organizing today's event. The roller coaster of politics that we've seen in Thailand in the past 7 years, and especially in the past several months, makes it extremely rash to try to offer any sort of outlook about the Thai situation. I will, however, use this afternoon to talk about two basic situations in Thai affairs that I think will condition events during 2012 and, in fact, well beyond 2012. The first of those situations is the state of the new Thai social and political order. The second is the looming succession in the palace and the future of the Thai monarchy, arguably the most important institution in Thailand since it was restored with the help of Field Marshal Surit Thanarat after 1958. First, to Thailand's new social and political order. In 2004, and in all likelihood from now on, Thailand will be a polity of citizens rather than subjects. For cultural, social, economic, and historical reasons, a vast segment of the Thai population that long conceded domination of the country's politics to officers of the Thai state and to their putative social betters in Bangkok is unwilling to concede dominance any longer. The dawning social and political dominance of this newly politically aware majority has at least three major implications. It suggests, that is, three major trends. First, the North, the Northeast, and to some degree rural central Thailand, and not just the political strongmen who claim to speak for those regions, will play a larger role in national affairs than they have in the past. This regional dimension of political change in Thailand also has a pronounced ethnic dimension. It has long been assumed, wrongly it is now clear, that the early and middle years of King Bhumipohn's long reign had made these regional and ethnic dimensions irrelevant. That was incorrect. Second, northern and northeastern Thailand will continue to be marked by growing and frankly unprecedented prosperity. Already between 2007 and 2011, economic growth in northeast Thailand outstripped Bangkok by 40% to 17%. To be sure, some of that growth was due to taxonomics, so-called populism. But some of it was also due to remittances from Bangkok, from Taiwan, from Singapore, from Israel. And some of that growth has become self-sustaining. Inevitable investment in infrastructure and better links to China and Vietnam will only increase the prosperity of northern and northeastern Thailand. The prosperity of those regions is tied to China's rise and to ASEAN integration. Those are also forces fueling Thailand's instability. While the people of the North and the Northeast will remain, on average, poorer, less well-educated than the people of Bangkok, their political orientation will be informed not by destitution, but by aspiration, not by grievance, but by feelings of stakeholdership. Many of these people already work, above all in blue-collar positions, in Bangkok. To the degree that they will vote in increasing numbers in Bangkok rather than in the provinces where their origins lie, even Bangkok politics will begin to reflect the priorities and influence of people from the North and the Northeast. Third, from shortly after the end of the Second World War through the 1970s, Thailand imposed extremely heavy taxes on agriculture to the advantage of the urban sector. From the 1970s onward, successive governments have reversed that flow of resources in a policy shift typical of economies in which agriculture and the rural sector represent a declining share of total activity. Most famously, or most infamously, among such policies adopted by the Yingluck government is the Rice Pledge Scheme, which has cost in excess of $20 billion and led to Thailand's losing its position as the world's leading rice exporter. This policy has proved exceedingly badly designed and probably unsustainable. Nevertheless, the baby cannot be thrown out with the bathwater. Intersectoral transfer payments will remain a central fixture of Thai economic policy. Participants in Thai politics will compete by means of the design and by means of the advantages of variants of such intersectoral transfer policies. Labeling these policies a form of vote buying will be a path to political irrelevance in Thailand. Sophisticated, technocratic, and informed political actors will make their mark in Thai politics by working to improve these policies, which, following trends dating to the mid-1970s, will be accepted across the political spectrum in Thailand. It should be noted that since 2001, former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra and political forces allied to him have benefited from each of the three trends that I have now mentioned. They may even have accelerated these trends. But neither Thaksin nor his approach to politics is responsible for these trends. And even if Thaksin and the Shinawatra family were to vanish from this earth tomorrow, these trends would continue to obtain in Thailand. They will define Thai politics and society not only in the next year, but also in the next decade or decade and a half. Now, if neither a coup nor the intervention of the courts prevents it, Thai voters will go to the polls on the 2nd of February. If they do, they will elect a parliament whose majority reflects trends that I have just described. The reason that I can say that with such certainty is that Thailand's Democrat Party, having failed in multiple elections either to defy or to accommodate itself to the trends noted a moment ago, has decided to sit these elections out. But supporters of that party, the Democrats, have also prevented the registration of parliamentary candidates in 28 constituencies in 8 provinces of southern Thailand. As this total represents more than 5% of the total membership of the lower house of Thailand's parliament, it will be impossible to seat a government after February 2nd if those 28 seats remain vacant. So, even if polls do occur, and there's no coup, and there's no court decision, on the 2nd of February, those polls may nevertheless launch Thailand into the unknown. And that circumstance of the unknown could, in turn, well serve as the pretext for a coup. Of course, the self-proclaimed People's Committee for Absolute Democracy with the King as head of state, or PCAD, a group fronted by veteran Democrat Party stalwart Suthep Thaugsuban, is determined to prevent next month's polls. This is despite the Thai kings having signed on 9 December a royal decree authorizing those polls. The PCAD has promised to paralyze Bangkok on Monday, January 13th. This plan to paralyze the city is one more round in the PCAD's efforts to goad the Thai army into mounting a coup. All along, or so far rather, it has failed to goad the Thai army into mounting a coup, but that clearly remains one of its major goals. It's extremely irresponsible to sit or stand, in this case here in Singapore, and calmly to opine about the likelihood of political violence in Thailand. but fatal encounters between supporters of the PCAD and supporters of the Yingluck government on the night of 30 November, and between supporters of the PAD and the Thai police on 26 December, underline the underlying potential for extreme and widespread violence in Thailand during 2014. Specifically, either a failure to honor the results of February's polls or judicial or military intervention to block those polls would risk provoking a violent reaction on the part of Thai red shirts. Should this reaction come not just in Bangkok, but in dispersed locations across provincial Thailand, the country would approach a condition of outright civil war. In opposing the early elections endorsed by last month's royal decree, the PCAD stresses the need for what it calls the reform of the Thai political system before polls are held. Echoing language introduced into Thai political discourse by King Bhumibol at the height of the Cold War, the PCAD seeks to create a body of good people to rule the country and to oversee the reform process. This agenda has 9 noteworthy aspects. First, the PCAD's agenda is strikingly vague. It energizes its backers via a visceral hatred of Thaksin that has long distracted those backers' attention from the developments in Thai society that I mentioned earlier. Developments from which Thaksin has, to be sure, benefited, but for which he is not responsible. The PCAD similarly recycles tired charges of vote buying that bespeak contempt for the judgment of the majority of the country's electorate. Second, the PCAD's effort at political reform would embody the third major attempt in less than 2 decades on the part of Bangkok interests and Thai royalists to clip the wings of Thai voters. The first was the reformist constitution of 1997, and the second, the current constitution, created in 2007 under the auspices of the military junta that seized state power in the armed putsch of September 2006. Each of these earlier attempts at reform failed. They failed in the face of the trends in Thai politics and society that I have already noted. Third, each of those earlier attempts at reform also produced putatively independent bodies to check and balance the Thai electorate. Yet, the naked politicization of those bodies by opponents of Thaksinism has given the very idea of independent bodies in Thailand a bad name. Tuesday's National Anti-Corruption Commission finding of malfeasance against over 300 Thai politicians for voting to amend the Thai constitution in accordance with procedures set forth in that same constitution is only the latest case in point. It's widely understood as the first step in a possible judicial coup against the Pheu Thai party government that will take power after next month's election. The record of this sort of act on the part of Thailand's notionally independent and apolitical bodies is a crippling legacy with which the country will have to live for many years. Fourth, while the PCAD is reliant for muscle on rural people from the Democrat Party's Southern Thai heartland, it relies for its most important support on only a thin sliver of Thai society. Very perceptively, Chris Baker and Pasuk Pongpajit label this sliver of support the middle class of a Bangkok transformed by globalization, mostly of Chinese origin, which had prospered, embraced modernity, and identified itself with booming urban Asia, rather than with the rest of its own country. Rather more provocatively, and not altogether fairly, Benedict Anderson labels this group timid, selfish, uncultured, consumerist, and without any decent vision for its country's future. The PCAD's leadership envisions this sliver of its supporters as the Muan Maha Prachachon, or great mass of the people. It uses, that is, terminology that echoes the fascist politics of interwar Central Europe and even of Ali Murtopo's floating mass during the Suharto dictatorship in Indonesia. And as the eminent Thai historian Nitti Iosiwong has recently written, this terminology recalls the social atomization and totalitarianism that scarred so much of the 20th century. Fifth, Suthep Thaugsuban is merely a frontman for the powerful interests standing behind the PCAD. He acts with the backing of other influential forces, apparently segments of the Bangkok business community, segments of the military establishment, and elements of Thailand's network monarchy. Sixth, the political order founded on this so-called great mass of the people that the PCAD would introduce would require continuing and intensifying repression. Even then, it would prove unsustainable in Thailand. Seventh, the PCAD needs to be extremely careful about what it wishes for. As I will explain in a moment, the PCAD is hardly the only group in Thailand with an agenda for so-called reform. Eighth, one of the very few specific elements of Suthep's call for political reform is the introduction of elected governors for Thailand's provinces. The origin and intent of this proposal are very unclear. Not only does it highlight, however, a process of political devolution that seems increasingly inevitable in Thailand, but it also may ironically pave the way to eventual resolution of the violent crisis in Thailand's far south. Serious efforts to resolve that crisis remain, however, hostage to the national crisis in Bangkok. Ninth and finally, among these aspects of the PCAD's agenda for Thailand is a particular urgency for its determination to install the People's Council, about which it talks on. And that urgency relates to the second of the Thai situations that I want to highlight this afternoon. That situation involves succession to the next reign and the future of the Thai monarchy. In an open letter released on the 18th of December, one of Thailand's most senior intellectual figures challenged parties from across the Thai political spectrum to participate in the February 2nd elections, and in so doing to offer voters clear platforms for reform. First among the matters that this intellectual urged them to include in their platform was a statement about reform of Article 112 of Thailand's Criminal Code, the article governing the crime of lèse-majesté. The future of the Thai monarchy and its role in Thai life are central to Thailand's current crisis, and they will be central to developments in 2014. American diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks have made clear to the world how concerned senior members of Thailand's network monarchy are about the coming succession. We need, however, to understand those concerns in a particular context. When King Bhumibol ended his European childhood and young adulthood to return to Thailand from Switzerland in 1951 and live in Thailand for good, senior courtiers were ready carefully to manage his transition into the role of full-time king. I know a senior anthropologist who began doing fieldwork in central Thailand, in northeastern Thailand in the early 1960s, and a villager at that time said to him once, "It's great. When I hear the king on radio now, he doesn't speak with a foreign accent the way he used to speak." And the reason for that is that a man whom we can identify very easily, if we know Bangkok intellectual circles, was tasked with improving the king's Thai when the king returned to the country in 1951. There were other aspects of this new reign that were managed by senior courtiers in the early and mid-1950s. The revival of monarchy as a central institution in Thailand and the leading role in Thai politics that King Bhumibol has played for many decades reflect the success of this process of management of the monarchy that these senior courtiers undertook after the king arrived in November 1951. Members of today's network monarchy understand that management of the monarchy during the transition to a new reign will be crucial to the success of that transition and perhaps even to the monarchy's survival. Many in the network fear nothing so much as Thaksin Shinawatra playing a leading role in the transition. They thus fear the consequences of a Thaksinite government being in power as that transition unfolds. The determination of the forces behind Suthep and his PCAD to oust the Yingluck government and to deny Yingluck the legitimacy that a fresh electoral mandate would bring relates very directly to these fears. They help explain Suthep's frantic efforts to keep Thai voters from going to the polls on the 2nd of February. They also help explain the mission of his proposed unelected People's Council made up of good people. Basic among the tasks of this People's Council would be to safeguard management of the eventual transition to a new reign. Red shirts, of course, have their own view of these matters. Email circulating among Pheu Thai politicians and red shirt leaders in northeast Thailand has alleged that a violent incident planned for the 9th of December was meant to trigger a coup on the part of an important faction of the Thai army. But these email messages say the heir to the throne moved to head off that coup by prevailing upon Prime Minister Yingluck to dissolve the Thai parliament on the 8th of December. It's impossible to know the truth of these reports, but they echo the views of some people in Thailand that the advent of the next reign is already underway. And if these reports are true, the speed with which a royal decree calling for elections on the 2nd of February was issued bears careful consideration. These brief observations on the central place of concern over the future of the Thai monarchy in what lies ahead for Thailand have 5 major implications. First, the post-1957 revival of Thai monarchy, long vaunted as a source of stability for the country, has now become a clear source of instability. Second, extreme hatred of Thaksin has supplanted clear-headed analysis of a problem that would exist even if, again, he vanished from the scene. Third, this problem lies, above all, in charting a fresh, more modest role for monarchy in Thailand. That modest role must come in a Thailand that is much more complex and much wealthier than the Thailand to which King Bhumibol returned from Lausanne in 1951. It's a Thailand with a better informed and a more sophisticated citizenry, and it's a Thailand less of whose talent is prepared to devote itself to long-term service to the throne. In this Thailand, the monarchy must discover a relevance to national concerns analogous to that demonstrated by King Bhumibol during the era of Cold War counterinsurgency. It must also learn from the world's truly constitutional monarchies. Fourth, the same cultural, social, and economic trends that have so thoroughly reshaped the Thai political order also pose a challenge to the Thai monarchy. In many ways, the system of hierarchy in society that the PCAD is fighting so desperately to preserve is dependent on notions of status grounded in the presence of a respected figure at the very top of the Thai social order. Those notions of status have less and less purchase with many people in Thailand. Networks of frankly Republican sentiment are gaining strength and coherence in the country. Some observers of Thai politics believe that the monarchy would struggle to survive reform of the law of lèse-majesté. Fifth, while it is common in Thailand to refer to the royal institution, in living memory, that institution has owed its strength to the perceived achievements of one man. As his passing from the scene nears, the destruction done to other institutions in Thailand, above all, Thailand's highest courts and its notionally independent agencies, by both parties to Thailand's Great Divide during the past decade will prove more and more costly to the country. This cost will be one that the citizens of Thailand will have to bear both in 2014 and thereafter. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that well-structured presentation that combines both a historical perspective with a lot of up-to-date information. Turning from Thailand now to Malaysia, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Jahabar Sadiq. He is the CEO and editor of the Malaysian Insider, which is Malaysia's fastest-growing news portal and one of its most authoritative. In addition to many years working as a correspondent, I would also like to commend Mr. Jahabar on his exceptional stamina as he has overcome dengue fever to be with us here today. Over to you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for staying back the whole day. My name is Jahabar. Heard a lot of speakers. I'd like to thank ISIS for calling us here. Malaysia won't be as exciting as Indonesia or Thailand this year. We've already had our general elections. We've already had party elections for all ruling parties. And when I wrote my piece for my presentation today a few months ago, I said two things will dominate 2014, and that was domestic economy and politics. In the last 2 weeks, we saw another version of that. The government had cut subsidies and everybody was angry. Electricity prices went up, sugar prices went up, fuel prices went up. And stung by criticisms, the government decided, the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister and Chief Secretary of Government decided that they would cut their entertainment allowance by 10%. Their entertainment allowance is 1,500 ringgit a month, so they're cutting back 150 ringgit. The other thing was politics. In the last 10 days, we saw the reignition of a 5-year-old controversy in Malaysia over who has the right to use the word Allah. The state governments believe only Muslims are allowed to use the word and no one else can. It became a court case that regulated a Catholic publication can't use the word in its Bahasa edition. And the government and Malay, some conservative Malay and Muslim groups decided that covered everything, which led to this shiza of 320 Bahasa Bibles and Iban Bibles. And so, again, according to Reza Aslan, we've become the laughing stock of the world. Only country in the world to regulate who can use Allah. You take those two situations and you will see that nothing has changed in Malaysia in the last decade since Dr. Mahathir stepped down. When Dr. Mahathir stepped down, it was because he was becoming increasingly unpopular. In his place was a man called Abdullah Badawi, who was also unpopular towards the end. And now we have a man called Najib Razak. On his shoulders lies the fate of the country. For the next 1 year, nothing will happen to him, seriously, because he's spending most of his time traveling around the world instead of being in Malaysia. And this is where the problem for this country is. Nothing is going to happen in the country. As I said, we won't be as exciting as Indonesia or Thailand. But what is interesting is, because we have a prime minister who's decided that he lives in two worlds, he wants to stride the world stage as a man who has repealed all kinds of oppressive laws in our country. He has freed the economy, he's liberalized sectors, he's opened it up. We are negotiating with 11 other Pacific Rim countries. Malaysia is going to chair ASEAN next year when the ASEAN Economic Community takes effect. Malaysia is the one country that still wants to send a second astronaut to space. So we want to do a lot of things globally. Simple reason is because Mahathir 20 years ago made Malaysia punch above its weight class. It was a country that hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Governments meeting. It hosted the OIC meeting. It did a lot of things. It was active in Bosnia. It was active in a lot of places. So Dato Sri Najib has decided that if he can replicate what Dr. Mahathir has done, Dr. Mahathir once called him, and leave him in peace, unlike the previous prime minister. So therein lies the problem. In a country, we have a prime minister who has won the general elections, has won his party elections uncontested, yet his one problem is a man called Dr. Mahathir, and maybe 40 other people who've decided that he is useless to them, that he has to go for the simple reason he is not helping them, make money, keep power, and he's not listening to them. Okay, this is the far-right Malay groups, includes a group called Perkasa. We had two candidates from Perkasa who were UMNO members who became Barisan Nasional candidates in the last elections. They lost. But they still insist that they hold more power. For the simple reason, in the last general elections, the Barisan Nasional lost 7 more seats. It kept power because of votes from East Malaysia. It kept power because it had votes from rural areas. Mainly Malay, mainly Bumiputera natives in Sabah and Sarawak. It did not win the votes of 25% population Chinese, the 7% population Indians. So it lost a lot of votes, despite Najib Razak spending more than $1 billion courting them, giving them new schools, education grants, and allowing them to use the word Allah in Sabah and Sarawak. But if you cross over across the South China Sea and you land in Kuala Lumpur, you can't use that word. So one country, 2 laws, just like China. So when you have that, you have a situation where no one is happy with you. Mr. Najib Razak is a very popular man, actually. He's very popular because for the last 2 years before elections, he gave everyone whatever they wanted. You want an Islamic law, I give you an Islamic law. You want Chinese schools, I give you Chinese schools. He was Santa Claus. He gave away everything. He gave money to people who didn't have enough money. If you earn below 3,000 ringgit, you get a one-off cash grant. This year, if you earn below 4,000 ringgit, you get a cash grant. In spite of having a vision where we are going to make more money every year. By 2020, Malaysians are supposed to have a per capita income of 15,000 US. Right now, it's about 7,000 US. It's not going to happen for the simple reason they've suddenly realized that although the country has a growth of 4 to 5% every year, all that money, all that income is generated and kept by government-linked companies. It doesn't trickle down to the man on the street. And because of rising costs, people are unhappy. People are unhappy because we have more urban poor in the country. They've decided to show him the finger, and he's unhappy because of that. So he's in a situation where he's tried to help them. They didn't vote him in. And a lot of conservative Malay groups are unhappy with him because he pandered to them instead of to their group, to the Malays who already have a lot. In the last 40 years since we have this new economic policy, more shares, more grants, more of a lot of everything has been given to Malay groups. Except, again, it hasn't trickled down to them. It's gone to a few tycoons and businessmen and politicians. The latest news yesterday, we have this very famous businessman. His name is Syed Mokhtar Al-Bukhari. If you look at his portfolio of companies, he deals in everything from sugar, rice, to airports and ports. Very rich, well, apparently he's a very rich man. His leverage is about 20 billion US. That's the amount of loans under his name. He won a digital television transmission deal. So in Malaysia, you've got this situation where the government of the day is privatizing everything to 1 or 2 men. Again, causing unhappiness among others, among the Chinese, among the Indians, and also among the Malays. And so it has left the Prime Minister under attack from Dr. Mahathir's people, these 40 people. They're either bloggers or they actually hold certain interests in the country. They also hold certain positions. These 40 people is causing him trouble. And in this whole year, Najib Razak will be distracted by these 40 people that he won't be able to run the country well. And when that happens, you're still going to have a lot more issues coming up over religion. The row over the word Allah will dominate us for the entire year. Right? The row over our economy, subsidies and rising living costs will dominate us for the entire year. It will leave Malaysia as a country which is almost rudderless. It won't go anywhere. We will have growth, 5%. Our property sector will boom. The only sector that's booming in Malaysia is property. The outlook for the entire year is, if any of you want to invest in property, come over to Malaysia. Manufacturing is on its way down. Factories in Penang are empty, they're idle. We are sending back workers back to Indonesia, to Thailand. And we have a government that is not able to do anything about this. For the simple reason, we do not have technocrats. We are a country where we've outsourced everything to consultants who have no idea what's going on in the country. So they've come up with policies which do not make sense to the civil servants, because the civil servants are saying, I only make so much this year, but the consultants make 10 times more. So why should I follow plans made by someone who doesn't understand what's going on in the country? Again, you have another sector which is not happy with the Prime Minister, the civil servants, 1.4 million of them. And when you combine all these things, you're going to find a country that someone was telling me just now, you guys are in a middle income trap. We're just not in a middle income trap, we're just stuck in a rut and unable to move forward in any which way we can. Just because we have a political leader who doesn't know what to do. And if you think I'm harsh in saying this, I'm actually being very kind to him. I actually think he actually has some knowledge on what to do. But he's unable to do it because his party has decided that the people around him are people who have vested interest. They're only interested in lining their own pockets. They're interested in being the next leader. So they are not interested in developing the country. You do have to realize, unlike our neighboring countries, Indonesia, which has gone through their reformasi, or Thailand, which goes through a few coups every once in a while, that we are a country which has only one party since day one, like Singapore. And just like Singapore, our Prime Minister is the son of a former Prime Minister. And so, but unlike Singapore, I'm not sure what to say when I'm in Singapore about this. We have the princelings who think they're entitled to be prime ministers without any qualification. Dato Sri Najib Razak is a decent guy. I'll grant him that. He hasn't fought his way to be prime minister. It was red carpeted to him over the last 30 years. So he cannot understand why people don't like him. He can't understand why his policies don't work, because he's so detached. He's so detached because he lives in a bubble called Putrajaya, where everybody agrees with what he says. My office is in Bangsa. We are another bubble. I work in a suburb where people think nothing of lunch with red wine and white wine. While 3 kilometers down the road, people don't have money to live. So we are a country where we have a lot of bubbles. And these bubbles are making Malaysia slow down, in the sense that we have this trust deficit. This trust deficit is making Malaysia actually stop at its tracks. You know, more people want to leave the country. They want to go down to, well, most of them are here in Singapore. They want to go down to Australia. They're staying back in England, although there are no jobs in England. So we are losing our first-class talent, and we are getting third-rate construction worker talent from and security guards from Nepal, whose last job was holding a pitchfork. When you have all this happening, you're asking yourself, so what's going to happen? Was there political leadership? And that question comes out because we are a country where we have a strong man before called Mahathir Mohamad. We've always believed in a political solution, right? It's not going to happen anymore. You have a prime minister who's there because he's the son of a prime minister. You have a rest of cabinet who are there because they are friends of the son of the prime minister. You have a civil service that's not interested in his job because there are consultants being paid 10 times more to tell them what to do, but will not take responsibility when that thing fails. You have a whole population of middle class, growing middle class, that see their neighbor Singapore is doing better. Indonesia is booming. Thailand, in spite of its coup and floods and everything, is also doing well. The countries in the Indochina are doing better. So they're envious that even Myanmar is just three steps down from us in the World Press Freedom Index. Myanmar is just 3 steps down from us. And so they think, well, so what's going on in Malaysia? After 50 years of independence, why can't I call this country mine? Why can't I earn that much money? And why can't I call my God Allah? Now, when you combine all that, you have a lot of unhappy people, you have a lot of unhappy ministers and politicians, including those from the opposition, one of them who's here. Very unhappy country, right? So how do you move beyond that? For the whole of 2014, Malaysia would be mired in the same rut it was mired in for the last 5 years. It can't go forward. It's digging, not forward and out. It's digging in deeper, all right? So for the next 1 year, you're not going to find leadership on regional issues from Malaysia. We are going for United States Security Council. Most likely Malaysia will get it because it's a very nice country. People are nice. But that's all. No leadership on any issues. No leadership on domestic issues until maybe by 2018 when we have another general elections where nothing is also going to happen. So I don't even know why you're listening to me. But I can tell you this. What's interesting is we've just realized that we are a 50-year-old country, Malaysia, I mean, not Malaya. And we know, most Malaysians, middle-class Malaysians know they want something better. Except they don't think the alternative is any better than what they have. Right? Unlike Indonesia, which went through its reformasi, and where anything is better than President Suharto. Malaysians generally don't believe anything's better than Barisan Nasional. Is that fortunate, unfortunate? I'm not too sure. The simple reason is because the opposition, which consists of 3 major parties, PKR, DAP, and PAS, themselves can't agree on public policy, on economic policy, on education policy. They can't even say they are secular, because you say you are a secular grouping, you lose the votes of the majority Malays. If you say you are Islamist, you lose the votes of the minority Chinese and Indians. Still a country which counts itself more as Malay, Chinese, Indian rather than Malaysians. I don't know, any of you been to Malaysia? Ever experienced that? I don't know, when we come overseas, we say we're Malaysians. I think Singaporeans say the same. But when you have all that, they've decided they will live with the devil they know and the devil they don't know. You know, until you have a coalition of parties in the opposition that can say, look, we are a Malaysian party, we have policies, you're not going to have any change in Malaysia. Good or bad? I think in the present circumstances, this government has done so well for itself. It has promoted investment. We're a pretty free country. Don't read the newspapers, because that's a different world. If you read the newspapers, you see a Malaysia you don't see anywhere else, except in the newspapers. If you read my website, you see a Malaysia you don't see also. You just get angry all the time. But in between all that is a Malaysia which is very vibrant. In spite of the lack of government that we have, the country still runs. Services still go on. The traffic jam is still there. And Najib has decided that the best way is by replicating Dr. Mahathir, i.e. 1, put in more infrastructure, put in a lot of funds for the majority Malays. We've got a new economic fund for them, which is worth 30 billion ringgit, that's 10 billion US. And most of the money doesn't go to them, it just goes to training them to do business. Nowhere else in the world you have an institute to train entrepreneurs. You know, entrepreneurs are self-made people. You want to do business, you do on your own. We are going to train them to do business. He's going to invest in all this in the hope that what Dr. Mahathir could do in the 80s, he can do in the 21st century, without realizing two things. One, in the 80s, you didn't have Indochina coming up. You didn't have a lot of other countries coming up out of their mess. Even Philippines is doing better now. And the other thing is, our education system in the last 30 years has stopped us from developing talent. We've regressed in the sense our medium of instruction is now in Bahasa. And that's bad at a time when the world is global and everyone's still using English. Singapore, China, more people are learning English every day. Indonesia, I worked in Indonesia for 2 years. Most popular language course is English. So we lose on two things. We lose on the fact that other countries have caught up and gone beyond us, and we lose on education. So we become very uncompetitive, and the government of the day doesn't understand why we are uncompetitive. It fails to see that its policies in the last 30 years, which Dr. Najib was part of the government, has made the people, uncompetitive, untalented, unable to move around and work elsewhere, or actually bring more talent to Malaysia to work together in Malaysia. We have more Malaysians with talent, well, the few of them who don't want to come back and who are in Silicon Valley, majority in Singapore, like my fellow Malaysian from CIMB, they'd rather work here, they'd rather work elsewhere. Right? So as long as you have a situation where nobody trusts the government, Malaysia will just be flip-flopping like a fish out of water for a while. We won't be able to move anywhere. When I told a friend of mine that I'm going to speak here, he said, don't be so pessimistic. But the reality is, I can't but feel pessimistic about my country because I have seen it in the last 5 years since I got back from Indonesia, and I've compared it with other countries, and I know it can do a lot more. You know, I don't want to end this evening on a very sad note for Malaysia, but why are you guys laughing? It's sad. No, the thing is, this is the reality in our country. We can do a lot better, but we have voted in a government because the alternative is not so good to the majority of Malaysians. We have a prime minister who should actually be a lot stronger, but he is sulking at the fact that the majority of Malaysians don't want him. He lost the popular vote. So until he gets out of his funk, we can't get out of funk. Because most Malaysians only know political solutions. They can't think of any other solution for this country to progress. But then again, I guess that goes well with all other countries, whether it's Thailand or Indonesia or Singapore or, I was going to mention Brunei, but no, not Brunei. Any other ASEAN country. So going forward, 2014, do not expect Malaysia to take leadership in anything regional or international, because we are so stuck in what internally in our country, we can't think beyond our shores. Internal issues will dominate our politics. Will it cause an impact on the economy? No, but be prepared for some policy flip-flops that might affect investment. I don't expect much on that score. There's still one more foreign investments. They're looking at Japan now, back to China, back to Middle East, and the main investment will be property and infrastructure. That's what the country's outlook is. Build more trains, build more buildings, build more housing, because the ringgit is cheap and everybody is welcome. And of course, the last bit, it's Visit Malaysia year, so if you've never been to a Legoland, you should come, because we're the one country that destroyed a 1,500-year-old Hindu temple up north in favor of a Legoland down south. Right? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jahabar, for that up-to-date and insightful presentation. Now we'll turn to questions. Before we look at some of the questions that have come up on Pigeonhole, I will sneak in one myself, and that is to both of these gentlemen, and that is the role of the passing of the big men. As we know, personalities are important. In some cases, we have blendings between personalities and institutions. People have been around so long that they have almost themselves become an institution. So I would like to ask Mike to speculate a little bit about the passage from the king to who will be his successor and what sorts of impacts that can have on the current political context, perhaps over the next year or two. And similarly for Jahabar, you talked at the beginning about Mahathir being a bit of a constraining force on the room for maneuver of the Prime Minister. At some point, of course, while he is extremely energetic, very, very well preserved, you know, at some point he will begin to fade from view. And perhaps if you could tell us a little bit about how that can help or hinder the room for maneuver for the Prime Minister. Over to you, Mike, first.
As we saw on the 4th of December, the eve of the Thai King's birthday, when by custom he speaks to the country on television, he's in very bad physical condition. Among the revelations in the WikiLeaks cables was Suthep Thaugsuban telling an American diplomat that the king's biggest problem as of some years ago was depression, and that he just didn't have his heart in what he had done for so many decades any longer. What this means is that we are already in many ways in a Thailand whose sovereign is unable to play the extremely active role in politics that King Bhumibol played for many decades. What this means is that the network monarchy is running the palace, but it is rash to assume that the network monarchy is in any way monolithic. As the king grows more and more infirm, as in due course he passes away, it's fairly clear that the biggest issue will not be his death or the activities of his successor, but rather squabbles among people who would steer the process, manage the process, maybe even seek to control the process. We've in many ways seen already how nasty these squabbles can be and how serious they can be for Thailand. It's clear to me that these squabbles and the process of what's really infighting through the transition are Thailand's greatest worry. I'm less concerned about what the next reign will look like, because I think it's very clear that monarchy will play a reduced role in Thailand in the future. That reduced role is a function of the greater complexity of Thailand that I alluded to in my talk, and the fact that the next sovereign, the next king, I would say, will not have the stature and the earned right to be active that his father had, quite simply. King Bhumibol was not able to act decisively when he returned from Switzerland in 1951. He had to build up credibility first. And early in the next reign, the king will not have that sort of credibility. It's a good thing that the monarchy will be less active in the future, because the monarchy will, again, as I noted in my talk, be served by far less capable people than was the case 50 and 60 years ago, even 40 years ago. Much easier to be an investment banker, to work for CMIB in Thailand, than it is to spend your life in the palace and never be heard from. That's just the reality. Okay. There is, however, one further issue, and Thailand is a place where history and ideas and conceptions of the nation and the society really matter. And another source of squabbles, another source of fighting, will be ongoing assessments of recent Thai history, ongoing examination of the details of the reign. As I said in my talk, 5 years ago in Thailand, there were people with Republican sentiments. Today, there is a network of republicanism in Thailand. And there are bright, well-informed, outspoken Thais who don't say overtly that Thailand should be a republic and the monarchy should end, but who come as close to saying that as they can. Now, what will result from the greater and greater appearance of republicanism in the Thai public sphere is another form of squabbling. The violence that can ensue because diehard royalists are intolerant of people who don't want there to be a monarchy in Thailand anymore, can turn into something very violent. That many of these diehard royalists don't really understand the reign of King Bhumibol, both in its positive and its negative aspects, is almost beside the point. So I should say that I'm not pessimistic about the transition. And I'm not pessimistic necessarily about the future of monarchy in Thailand, but I'm deeply pessimistic about the ways in which the transition will serve as a pretext for what could become ferocious and tragic battles in the country.
Thank you, Mike. John.
Hi. I think if and when Dr. Mahathir passes on, we're actually quite bad for Malaysia. If you look at history, he was the first non-political blue blood to lead UMNO. And under his time, 22 years and 3 months, he had brought a lot of physical improvements to the country, moved it from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. He tamed the rulers, the royalty. He curtailed their powers. And he basically reset Malaysia in his image. Of course, I think he stayed on too long, and then all the excesses happened. Since then, no one has ever been as strong as him in Malaysia. Abdullah Badawi wasn't that strong. Abdullah Badawi loved his party. He didn't fear his party. He loved his party too much. He allowed it to have its excesses. Najib Razak fears his party. He's not seen as strong. And the royalty, the 9 royal families are asserting themselves again, as can be seen in various actions in the last couple of years. So Dr. Mahathir has actually been the conscience of the regular folks in UMNO, and also for his own legacy. When he passes on, but of course he comes from a family that lived for a long time. His elder sister died when she was 92. Mahathir is 89. But when he passes on, you're going to find an UMNO and a Malaysia that's a lot more feudal, will more closely resemble Brunei than Indonesia in many aspects of our politics and even our economy. So that's what's going to happen to Malaysia.
Thank you very much. A question for Mike. It has 6 votes, not so many, but it's actually very interesting. What is motivating SUTEP to aggressively push for the anti-government protests, especially when his future in politics looks bleak? Could you tell us a little bit about this personality and perhaps what are some of his drivers?
Let me answer the question itself first and then Francis's follow-up. If we think about what SUTEP is planning to do on Monday, that's closing down Bangkok, very simply, there are 2 motivations. He's practicing what the scholar of Thailand, Duncan McCargo, calls rally politics. That is, you don't have a real organization, you don't have a network, you don't have branches, you don't have structures, so you keep people on board by having rallies, getting them out, keeping them motivated, getting them excited. And as he's proved since early November, this has been eminently feasible in middle-class Sino-Thai Bangkok so far. So rally politics is one of his motivations for these continuing protests. But more seriously, as I said, he's frantically trying to stop the elections. He's frantically trying to stimulate some sort of intervention that will prevent another Thaksinite party from coming to power. Now, and I should say, as I noted, I mean, SUTEP is a front man. There is no one in Bangkok who can honestly believe that this is SUTEP's movement wholly. They're people, forces, financiers, institutions behind him. And among the most important concerns on the part of his backers is this concern over the future of the monarchy and the succession. Who is this man? Well, this is actually an interesting story because he's a war horse from southern Thailand. His family is from Surat Thani, and he is a representative of the southern faction of the Democrat Party that owes its creation to a visionary liberal by the name of Surin Masadit, who was active in Thai politics from the 1950s until the 1970s, man from Nakhon Si Thammarat province just south of Surat Thani. But over time, the southern wing of the Democrat Party that Surin Masadit created has become more and more of a political machine, and it's become more and more tainted by money politics, and SUTEP is really a product of that. What's fascinating to me, and I will only say so much because the world does have defamation law, but what's fascinating to me is that this gentleman from rural southern Thailand, who looks like a Southern Thai, speaks like a Southern Thai, is identified with the southern wing of his party, has emerged so much as the darling of a very sinister cabal in the Bangkok elite. And one can speculate endlessly about the structure of this cabal, how Khun Suthep ended up being the front man for the cabal. I would say that Exhibit A in understanding this cabal is the identity of the spokesman for the PCAD, one Ekanat Prompan. Ekanat Prompan is Suthep's stepson, and he has 6, according to his CV, 6 Oxford degrees, and he has given an interview acknowledging that while he is the spokesperson for the groups that would restructure Thai politics, he has spent so much time overseas in school in Australia and the United Kingdom that he's a bit confused about the structure of the written Thai language. And this is the gentleman who would serve as spokesman for the group that is intent on restructuring Thailand. And I think that if one digs around a little bit and reads a little bit about Khun Ekanat and his background, one will learn more about how Suthep has been integrated into this Bangkok-centered royalist cabal, even though he's a southern political warhorse from Surat Thani province.
Thank you very much, Mike. A question for Jahabar. Has 9 votes. Is Anwar still a force to be reckoned with, or a spent one?
That's a very interesting question. I guess it was Anwar Ibrahim. I'll say I'm still a force. I generally, most people, when I say most people, most politicians want Anwar out of the game on both sides. He's really popular. UMNO fears him. They still want to put him in jail. On the Pakatan side, he is the glue that keeps them together, keeping sort of left of center DAP with very conservative Islamists in a coalition. So he's essential. If he's not there, you won't have a coalition. But I think it's because of his way of leadership, of managing issues, and it's similar to Dato Sri Najib, is avoiding it and delaying it. That is frustrating. He is first and foremost conservative in his own ways, and he is only in power or still there in the game because there is no one else like him at this point in time. No one from the Islamist Party past is acceptable to the wider audience in Malaysia. No one from DAP is acceptable to the majority Malays and natives in Malaysia. So the compromise candidate is Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim. For that reason, he is still a force. But by the time the next election comes around, he would be 71 years old, 70 to 71 years old. I think he still wants to be Prime Minister for sure, but looking at the way things are going, he might step aside and let someone take over. Might. 1% chance. 99% chance is he still wants to be Prime Minister. So he's a force because there's no one else. He's a farce because somebody else should take over. Thanks.
Thank you, Jahabar. A question for Mike. It has 4 votes. What are the prospects of the current political conflict spreading to the southern part of Thailand?
It depends how one understands South, and depends how one understands the current political conflict. I don't think that the Muslim majority Deep South will be any more of an issue, or sadly, any more of a concern, as it should be, in this national political crisis that the Kingdom of Thailand now finds itself in. But if I can reinterpret the question for my own purposes a little bit, one of the striking things here is that because of this legacy that the Democrat Party has in southern Thailand, a fair amount of people who are, to be sure, more affluent than farmers in the northeast and the north of Thailand and in poorer parts of the Central Plains, but who are still farmers and who still occupy lower ranks of the Thai social structure, are providing the muscle for the PCAD. If you look carefully at photographs of, for example, the protests at the Thai-Japan Youth Stadium, where registration was taking place in Bangkok some days ago, you could see people carrying placards with a character from Wayang, from Shadow Place. And these are people from Nakhon Si Thammarat, or Patalung, only those 2 provinces. This is a symbol of Patalung and Nakhon Si Thammarat to show your characters from the Shadow Place. So we can see the fact that rural people from southern Thailand have been brought in or have come as the muscle for these demonstrations. The real question over the long term, as this crisis goes on and as the political economy that I suggested in the optimistic first part of my talk evolves, is when will Southern Thai voters, I don't mean Muslim Southern Thai voters, I mean people from the Upper South, Buddhist voters, begin to vote like people from the North and Northeast? When will they realize that a rubber pledge scheme would be as nice as a rice pledge scheme? When will they realize that transfer payments to rural southern Thailand would be as nice as our transfer payments to rural lower northern Thailand, for example? And there is a prospect for a much less divided Thailand in 15 years if rural people with rural roots across the country begin to think and vote in the same way. To get there from here will be extremely difficult, partly because of the Democrat Party's long-term hold on the Southern Thai Buddhist vote. And it's a long-term hold that has been crucial to the success of the current protests. The night of the 3rd of November, I was at Democracy Monument waiting actually to meet somebody for dinner, and I had no idea when we made this rendezvous date that there was the point that there was going to be a protest there. And he was late, and I started talking to this farmer who was there sort of killing his time. And this is a man he was from Surat. He was a rubber farmer, not well educated, not a very fluent Central Thai speaker, spoke with a very strong Southern accent. And it's tragic because this man's economic and class interests are not served by protests of the Bangkok middle class. But this group from southern Thailand is supporting Suthep and his protesters. And how that will play out over the short term and the medium term has tragic implications, but one hopes in the long run good implications for Thailand.
Thank you, Mike. Jahabar, what will happen to the smaller Barisan Nasional component parties, given their poor electoral performance and greater UMNO assertiveness?
I think it's been an issue for the last 2 elections, the fate of parties like Gerakan, MCA and MIC, and PPP on the peninsula. Only MIC has sort of maintained their hold. The Chinese-based parties, Gerakan, MCA, have lost a lot. The fact of the matter is they have lost the trust of the communities they represent. Gerakan doesn't have the intellectual heft that it used to have. I can tell you that for certainty because they invited me to their WhatsApp group and they don't know who I am, so that's good. I get to peek at their conversations about issues and it's terrible. Going to the next elections, they are actually non-starters, non-performers. They will be in Barisan just to show that Barisan is a multiracial outfit, but they really have no power, no influence, and they're basically the charms in your charm chain for UMNO. Say, hey, I'm part of a multiracial coalition. And I think there's an internal debate going on in these parties about what they're going to do. The reality is they can't go to the opposition because nobody trusts them. They're too addicted to power and position as part of a ruling coalition. So they're in no man's land. By the next election, you're going to see fewer of them. You're going to see the rise of East Malaysian parties. They're going to assert themselves because in Sarawak, UMNO is not there. So everyone's favorite, I'm not going to use that C word, everyone's favorite politician, Tan Sri Thai Mahmud, will decide whether he wants to stay in Barisan or move, except I don't think Pakatan wants him. But East Malaysian parties will be the guys Barisan UMNO will have to go for to keep power, and not MCA, MIC, Gerakan, and PPP. They basically will have erased themselves from history.
Okay, thank you. We've discussed a fair amount of the political dynamics, and now we'll move a little bit into the area of economics and this issue of the TPP. So one of the questions is, how will Najib approach negotiations to the TPP? As an opportunity to push for reform, or will he seek to protect UMNO-related interests? And a related question I would ask Mike, which is basically, to what extent is the TPP a discussion point in Thailand? It's not part of the TPP, and it could actually be dramatically affected as it's very reliant on global production networks, and there could be serious tariff implications for it if it is actually left out?
Okay, very interesting question. Dato' Najib is actually a proponent of TPPA. He wants to sign it. That was last year, for the simple reason that Obama would have visited Malaysia. Well, that didn't happen because of the shutdown in America. But from my interaction with the International Trade Ministry, they are committed to the TPPA. They see it as a way to reform the local economy and do it in such a way that it's seen as an international concession, that we have to do it. We have to open up the economy to liberalize. Most Malay businessmen, and that includes UMNO-related interests, see it as a way of them getting less of the crumbs on the table. After all these years, there isn't that much to be given out anyway. The great fear is that they will lose out. How would Najib balance this? Not easy, for the simple fact is he hasn't been able to convince them that government procurement, a lot of things will not be affected by the TPPA. It's an ongoing process. His main impediment now is a man called Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who has thrown his weight against the anti-TPPA group. So he has to convince Dr. Mahathir Mohamad first. And that shows you the influence Dr. Mahathir Mohamad has on the country's economy and other policies. Once he can get Dr. Mahathir on his side, then he can get the rest of the guys on his side. Will that happen? It will, for the simple reason, Dato' Sri Najib is in charge of UMNO. Dr. Mahathir has no influence in UMNO. His son, who was gunning for a vice presidency, lost. And there's no one else from Dr. Mahathir's time or anyone who's young enough to be his supporter who will go against Dato' Sri Najib Razak. So I don't know when this pact will be concluded, but Najib is committed to it, and he will definitely sign it when it's ready to be signed, with whatever little concessions he can get for the Bumiputera businessmen.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I speak about trade matters at my own peril, but what I will say is that the politics of the TPP in Thailand are poisonous. The reason that they are poisonous is that even though Prime Minister Thaksin originally came to power in 2001 on a platform of economic nationalism, he has been tarred by his opponents with the brush of being a lackey for neoliberalism and American-led globalization, and fueling the process of tarring Thaksin with that brush have been two other elements in the Thai social and political structure. One is the medical profession, which is convinced that the TPP is in fact a plot by the international pharmaceutical industry to deny Thais access to drugs that they need. And we have to understand that the Thai medical profession has an extremely easy time rallying around the yellow flag, because Prince Mahidol, the king's father, was of course a physician himself. And second, the NGO movement similarly believes that the TPP is a neoliberal plot that will destroy the Thailand of local wisdom, a Thailand that has not existed for quite some time, and therefore the NGO movement is also extremely strongly opposed to progress on the TPP. So as I say, this is poisonous politically, and trade negotiations between Thailand and any group involving the United States have been poisonous politically really since 2006.
Thank you very much, Mike. Well, I'll open the floor for one question. I think we've sort of covered most of the ones that have come in on Pigeonhole. If you have a burning issue, Now is the time. The light is shining in my eyes, but in any case, I can't see any hands up. So with that, please join me. Oh, one, please, sir.
Mr. Yaneo.
Question is directed to Encik Sedek.
Yes, sir.
I think those of us who have interest in Malaysia would already know what's happening. So my question to you is that what do you think will be the outcome in 2014? Will there be more protests? Will there be more problems? Will there be an autocratic Najib? Or do you think they will be more accommodating to alternative points of view, because the economy is very important? Don't forget that Singapore has got lots of investments in Iskandar, and some of us also have got houses in Iskandar. And I'm sure you also know that China is looking at Malaysia, and so also with Japan and the others. So, is it pessimistic? Is it optimistic, or are you realistic?
Okay.
That's my question.
Thank you very much, sir. Will there be more protests? Yes. Will the government be more accommodative? No. Is there any optimism in Malaysia? Yes. It's very simple. There's going to be a lot more protests because the Pakatan Rakyat is stronger. They have the organizational skills to bring people to the streets. But if you realize and you see the trend from last year, they are not doing it. It's all being done by students and other groups. They're coming out on their own, especially with price hikes and subsidies. The government will crack down on them because we have a Home Minister, Senior Vice President Zahid Hamidi, who needs to prove that he is a lot more stronger and firmer than the previous Home Minister, Dato' Sri Hishamuddin Hussein. So he's going to make the police work harder. He's going to allow the law to run its course, the Peaceful Assembly Act, but they're going to act on the organizers and put them in, hold them over for a few days, soften them up a bit. You're going to see more of such action. And this is basically reminiscent of how Dr. Mahathir handled issues 8 years after or 6, 7 years after he came in. Well, to be specific, 6 years, 87. What happened was we had Operasi Lalang. So Dato' Sri Najib has been in power for 6 years. They're not going to take any opposition to them. And you have a Home Minister who's very strict. He will make sure it doesn't happen. Will that affect investments from China, from Singapore? No, because they're going to say that it's a social thing. Singapore would understand. China would understand that they have to take action against dissent, against people who have nothing else better to do, and they need to protect foreign investors. So those will be the excuses they trot out. But you're asking for a more accommodative government. I think you've seen over the last few weeks, or last few years, this government is not accommodative. They made their stand on various issues. They're not going to take a step back. It's a government that has only catered to votes and support from the far right. So now anything in the center is considered left. There's only that far right you can go. After a while, you go off a cliff. But they've decided this is their constituency. They will not budge anymore because if they do, they will lose the support of their core group, which is the Malay community. So I'm sorry to disappoint you. There won't be a friendlier government in Malaysia for some time yet.
Okay, thank you. The last question of the evening to the gentleman.
Yes, let me introduce myself first. My name is Sucha Pao Ari from the Cadet School of Social and Environmental Development, National Institute of Development Administration, or NIDA, in Thailand. Actually, I have one question to Dr. Michael, but before I ask the question, let me clarify something about the People Democratic Reform Committee first, because I am a member of the founder groups of the PDRC. I work with Suthep Thaugsuwat during the first day of demonstration. First, we don't want the military to stay the coup. That's the first thing. We want to make the new history of people's revolution, not the coup, not the military coup.
Sir, can we have a question?
Okay. Before question, just one thing. We believe that we will win in this political situation. What I would like to ask Mr. Michael is, what happened if we lost? Then I can get your answer back to Bangkok and to tell my guest mass of people that we must not lose because this is what you say. Thank you.
Over to you, Dr. Michael.
I appreciate that question. And without a political squabble, what I would answer is that the scenario that I outlined in the first part of my comments is really my answer. We need a Thailand that owes more to Prince Sithiporn Grittakon and to Krukrit Pramod and to Bunchu Ranasatien and their views of rural Thailand. We need a Thailand that understands that efforts to develop northern and northeastern Thailand, efforts on which the king himself expended many months in the best years of his reign, have led to a wealthier, more informed, more prosperous, more outward-looking Thailand. We need a Thailand that understands that just as people in Bangkok have become more sophisticated, speak English better, consume more foreign products, so people in rural Thailand have also become more sophisticated, better informed. We need to trust those people. What will Thailand look like, not if you lose, but when you lose? I'm hoping that you lose in a manner that causes as small amount of bloodshed as possible. But when you lose, within the next decade and a half, what Thailand will look like is what I outlined in the beginning of my presentation. It will be a Thailand where there are institutions that behave independently to check and balance the electoral process. Today, the Constitutional Court, the National Anti-Corruption Commission do not behave independently. They are political tools, they're laughing stocks in the eyes of a majority of the Thai population and in the eyes of the world, first. Second, it will be a Thailand in which policies that have been branded populist, that is, intersectoral transfer payments, are not understood as vote buying, but understood as normal policies in a developed economy and a mature society. It will be a Thailand in which people like yourself, well-educated, articulate people, work to make intersectoral transfer policies better, more efficient than, for example, Prime Minister Yingluck's disastrous rice pledge policy. Rather than criticizing the rice pledge policy, we need a better rice pledge policy, such as the policy that Mr. Suthep's party used when Mr. Appisit was Prime Minister. There's no question that Mr. Appisit had a better rice policy than Prime Minister Yingluck had. Why today is the idea of a rice policy branded as vote buying? Wasn't it vote buying when Mr. Appisit had a rice policy? So this is my view. And sir, what's inevitable in Thailand is that you can't win a people's revolution with a tiny sliver of Thai society. And that is what the PCAD, please note that abbreviation, the PCAD stands for, a tiny sliver of Thai society. Unless you plan on decades of repression, unless you plan on turning Thailand into a prison camp, the PCAD cannot win because you can't hold down people who are now Dasawang. It's very simple. That's what Dasawang is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had very insightful presentations and Q&A. Please join me in thanking our two presenters.
Thank you, Dr. Hutchinson and speakers. May I now invite Dr. Wee Ki Beng to deliver the concluding remarks for today?
Thank you, Devan. Right, dear friends, thank you for staying so long. You are the diehards, as usual. Well, we have come to the end of one of the most important days in the calendar of the Institute. On behalf of the Director of ISEAS and its staff, I want to thank all of you for wanting to take part in this event. There's much we have learned from our illustrious speakers, and I'm sure the issues raised today will give us food for thought, reason for hope or not, and also cause for anxiety. No man is an island, and no thinker thinks alone. So we brought everyone together today so that new ideas could be generated, not only within these walls, but even after you leave. Now, the region is going through a lot of challenges at the moment, as can be seen in the huge demonstrations in Bangkok, in Kuala Lumpur, in Phnom Penh, and in Dhaka, and even in Singapore, where some rioting took place a month ago. And natural disasters also threaten to increase in frequencies. Cost of living are rising fast, even as the income gap remains enormous. There's much we need to study and to contemplate. The dynamics of regional integration are also moving fast, alongside global economic changes and big power contestations. The governments of Southeast Asian countries will have to rely increasingly on new thinking, neighborly collaboration, and openness to change. Through constructive analysis and insightful suggestions, we can all contribute to the region at a time when it needs it most. I hope you will continue supporting our activities, reading our publications, and attending our conferences in the years to come. We will be here doing our best to facilitate research and deepen understanding of the challenges we are all facing. Now, ISEAS's many publications can be easily bought online or at our bookstore at ISEAS. ISEAS seminars are held regularly at the Institute, open to the public, and our e-publications are freely emailed to those who are interested in them. All you have to do is to make sure you come onto our mailing lists and visit our website as often as you wish. Let me finally take this opportunity to thank ISEAS staff members for doing a fantastic job in organizing this important event. Heartfelt thanks are also owed to our sponsors, Overseas Union Enterprise, Keppel Corporation, Professor Saw Swee Hock, Heineken, and STT Communications. Can we give them all a show of appreciation, please? Now let me end with this bit of very important information. The next Regional Outlook Forum will be held here on the 8th of January 2015, held here at the Shangri-La as always. And with that, we end this 2014's ROF. So goodbye for now, dear friends. Thank you again for coming, and travel safely. Thank you.